Most people think they understand something because it feels familiar. They recognize the words, follow the explanation, and move on. But familiarity is not understanding. Real understanding is rare because the brain is designed to avoid it. It prefers shortcuts, memorization, and comfort. In this video, you'll learn why your brain resists deep understanding and the exact method that forces it to stop pretending and start building real clarity that actually lasts. The method that forces your brain to truly understand anything. Why understanding feels so rare. Most people believe they understand something the moment it feels familiar. They recognize the terms, follow along with explanations, and nod at the right moments. This feeling is comforting, and it creates confidence. But familiarity is not understanding, it is simply recognition, and the brain is very good at confusing the two. Modern learning quietly trains this confusion. Information is presented quickly, packaged clearly, and repeated often. The brain learns to identify patterns on the surface without ever building a solid internal explanation. As long as nothing challenges that surface knowledge, the illusion of understanding holds. The moment conditions change, however, confusion appears. What felt clear suddenly collapses. This is why understanding feels rare. True understanding requires the brain to build connections, not just collect information. It demands that ideas fit together in a way that makes sense even when the situation changes. That process is slower and more demanding than recognition, so the brain avoids it whenever possible. Most people never notice this avoidance. They measure understanding by comfort. If something feels easy to follow, they assume it is understood. If it feels difficult, they assume they are not capable. In reality, difficulty is often a signal that real understanding is forming. Comfort usually means the brain is staying on the surface. Another reason understanding feels rare is that modern learning rarely forces it. People are rarely required to explain ideas in their own words, adapt them to new situations, or teach them clearly. Without these pressures, the brain has no reason to reveal what it does not know. It can hide behind memorized phrases and borrowed explanations. This creates fragile knowledge. It works only in familiar contexts. It cannot handle variation, stress, or unexpected questions. When someone asks why instead of what, the gaps become obvious. At that point, frustration replaces confidence, and many people retreat, assuming the problem is their intelligence. In contrast, real understanding feels different. It brings calm instead of anxiety. When something is understood, the mind can approach it from multiple angles. It can explain it simply, adjust it when conditions change, and recognize when something is wrong. This stability is rare because it is not accidentally acquired, it must be built. The tragedy is that most people are capable of this kind of understanding, but they were never trained to pursue it. They were trained to move on quickly, to cover material, and to rely on external explanations. Over time, the brain learns that shallow clarity is enough to get by. Once you see this pattern, confusion stops feeling personal. The problem was never your ability to understand. It was the method you were taught to rely on. And until that method changes, the brain will continue to settle for familiarity, instead of building the deeper clarity it is actually capable of producing. What real understanding actually is. Real understanding is often misunderstood because it does not feel dramatic when it forms. There is no sudden surge of confidence or emotional excitement. Instead, understanding feels quiet, it feels stable. It shows itself not through recognition, but through flexibility. When something is truly understood, the mind can move it, test it, and reshape it without breaking it. Most people define understanding as being able to follow an explanation. If they can track the steps while someone else is speaking, they assume the idea is understood. But following is not the same as owning. True understanding exists only when the explanation lives inside the mind, independent of the source that introduced it. At its core, understanding means the brain has built a mental model. A mental model is not a definition or a formula. It is an internal structure that explains how something works and why it behaves the way it does. When a model is present, new information has somewhere to attach. When it is missing, information floats without support. This is why memorization fails so often. Memorization stores fragments. It captures outcomes without causes. It creates knowledge that depends on repetition to survive. The moment repetition stops, decay begins. Understanding, by contrast, organizes knowledge around relationships. It answers why, not just what. That is what gives it durability. Another sign of real understanding is transfer. When you understand something, you can apply it in new situations without starting over. The context can change, the surface details can shift, and the idea still holds. This is impossible with memorized knowledge, which works only in the exact form it was learned. Understanding also reveals itself through simplicity. When a concept is understood deeply, it can be explained simply. Complexity collapses into clarity. This does not mean the idea becomes shallow. It means the mind has identified what truly matters and stripped away what does not. Simplicity is not the starting point of understanding, it is the result. Most people avoid this level of clarity because it requires confrontation. When you try to explain something simply, gaps appear. The mind resists this exposure. It prefers borrowed language and familiar phrasing because they hide uncertainty. True understanding removes that protection. It forces honesty. Adaptability is another marker. When something breaks or behaves unexpectedly, a mind that understands does not panic. It adjusts. It traces the structure, identifies where the assumption failed, and revises the model. A mind that memorized freezes. It has nothing to fall back on once the script changes. This is why real understanding feels effortful at first. It demands active engagement. The mind must test ideas, question them, and reorganize them. This process consumes energy, so the brain naturally tries to avoid it. But once the structure is built, effort decreases. The mind no longer struggles to hold information together. The model does the work. Understanding is not a single moment. It is a state the mind enters when structure replaces guessing. It is the difference between remembering steps and seeing the system. When understanding is present, learning accelerates because each new idea strengthens the existing framework instead of competing with it. On Sen, this definition becomes clear. The problem shifts. The question is no longer whether understanding matters. The question becomes why the brain so often avoids it, and what kind of method can make deep understanding unavoidable rather than optional. Why the brain avoids deep understanding. The brain does not avoid understanding because it is lazy. It avoids understanding because it is efficient. From the brain's perspective, deep understanding is expensive. It requires energy, attention, and time, and it offers no immediate reward. Recognition, on the other hand, is cheap. It feels satisfying, arrives quickly, and allows the brain to move on. This is why surface learning feels so attractive. When the brain recognizes familiar terms or patterns, it experiences a sense of progress without having to reorganize anything internally. That feeling is misleading, but it is powerful. The brain registers familiarity as success even when no real structure has been built. Another reason the brain avoids deep understanding is uncertainty. Understanding requires admitting what you do not know. It exposes gaps, contradictions, and fragile assumptions. The brain is wired to minimize discomfort, so it prefers paths that preserve confidence. Memorized phrases and borrowed explanations provide that safety. They allow the mind to appear competent without risking exposure. Cognitive shortcuts also play a major role. The brain constantly looks for ways to reduce effort. It categorizes, simplifies, and generalizes as quickly as possible. These shortcuts are useful for survival, but they interfere with learning. When a shortcut forms too early, the brain stops asking questions. It settles on an incomplete explanation and treats it as final. Speed culture reinforces this behavior. Modern learning environments reward quick answers, coverage, and completion. There is little incentive to pause and examine understanding deeply. Moving slowly feels like falling behind. As a result, the brain learns that depth is unnecessary. It adapts by prioritizing speed over clarity. Emotional factors add another layer. Many people associate struggle with failure. When understanding feels difficult, they interpret that difficulty as a personal weakness. This creates anxiety. Anxiety narrows attention and encourages retreat to safer strategies, like memorization. The brain learns that shallow clarity feels safer than deep confusion, even if it leads to weaker results. There is also the problem of delayed payoff. Deep understanding rarely delivers instant results. The benefits show up later, often in subtle ways like adaptability or long-term retention. The brain, however, is biased toward immediate rewards. It prefers strategies that produce quick feedback, even if that feedback is unreliable. Social reinforcement contributes as well. People are often praised for sounding knowledgeable, not for thinking clearly. Using the right terminology and repeating accepted explanations is rewarded. Asking basic questions or admitting confusion is discouraged. Over time, the brain learns to perform understanding rather than build it. This avoidance becomes automatic. The brain does not consciously decide to stay shallow. It simply follows the paths that have worked before. Familiarity feels good. Depth feels risky. Without a reason to change, the brain continues to operate this way. This is why telling yourself to understand more deeply rarely works. Motivation does not override wiring. The brain will always choose the path of least resistance unless the environment forces a different response. Understanding must become unavoidable, not optional. Once this is clear, the struggle looks different. Resistance is no longer a flaw. It is a signal. It shows where the brain is protecting itself from effort, uncertainty, or exposure. The goal is not to fight that resistance, but to design a method that bypasses it. Such a method does not rely on willpower. It does not ask the brain to choose depth over comfort. Instead, it removes the hiding places. It creates conditions where shallow familiarity no longer works, where confusion becomes visible, and where understanding is the only way forward. This is the turning point. Once you stop blaming the brain for avoiding understanding and start working with its incentives, the solution becomes clear. The next step is not trying harder. It is using a method that forces the brain to confront what it actually knows and what it does not. The method that forces understanding works because it removes the brain's ability to hide behind familiarity. Instead of allowing recognition to pass as knowledge, it demands explanation. The moment the brain is required to explain an idea clearly, in simple terms, its gaps are exposed. What felt obvious suddenly becomes uncertain, and that uncertainty is precisely where real understanding begins. Most learning methods allow passive agreement. You read something, it sounds reasonable, and you move on. This method interrupts that flow. It asks one question repeatedly. Can you explain this without relying on the original words? If the answer is no, understanding has not yet formed. The brain cannot escape this test because explanation requires structure, not memory. The first step is stripping the idea down to its core. Instead of repeating definitions, the learner tries to describe what is happening as if speaking to someone with no background knowledge. This immediately reveals whether the idea is grounded or borrowed. When language becomes vague or circular, the brain is forced to slow down and examine what it actually knows. Next comes reconstruction. Once confusion appears, the goal is not to ignore it, but to rebuild the idea from the ground up. This often means returning to basic principles and asking why each part exists. The brain begins forming connections instead of storing fragments. Each connection strengthens the internal model, making it harder for shallow understanding to survive. Feedback is essential at this stage. When an explanation is tested against reality, mistakes become visible. The brain sees where assumptions fail and where clarity is missing. This feedback is not discouraging, it is informative. Each correction sharpens the model and reduces future confusion. The mind learns not by avoiding errors, but by diagnosing them. What makes this method powerful is that it aligns with how the brain actually updates beliefs. The brain does not change because it is told to. It changes when predictions fail. By forcing explanation, predictions are made explicit. When they break, the brain has no choice but to adjust. Understanding becomes the only stable outcome. Another key element is simplification. True understanding allows complexity to collapse into clarity. When an idea is understood, it can be expressed in fewer words, not more. This process feels uncomfortable at first, because it removes protective language. But once simplicity is achieved, the idea becomes flexible and durable. This method also prevents false confidence. Many people feel confident until they are asked to explain. Here, explanation is the learning process itself. Confidence grows only as understanding grows. There is no shortcut. The brain cannot pretend. It must either build the structure or remain exposed. Importantly, this method does not require special intelligence. It requires honesty. The learner must be willing to confront confusion instead of covering it. The structure does the rest. Over time, the brain learns that shallow clarity is unstable while deep understanding feels secure. As the method is repeated, the brain adapts. It begins to anticipate explanation. It listens differently. Instead of collecting phrases, it searches for structure automatically. Learning slows briefly at first, then accelerates dramatically as models strengthen. Eventually, the method stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like a habit. The brain no longer settles for recognition. It seeks understanding instinctively. This is the moment when learning changes from accumulation to construction. At this point, understanding is no longer fragile. It does not depend on context or repetition. It holds under pressure. And when understanding becomes reliable, it can finally be carried forward, applied across domains, and turned into a permanent mental advantage, rather than a temporary achievement. Turning understanding into a permanent ability, the final transformation happens when understanding stops being something you try to achieve and becomes the default way your mind operates. At this stage, learning no longer feels fragile. It does not disappear when pressure increases or conditions change. Instead, understanding holds because it is built on structure rather than repetition. Most people treat understanding as temporary. They understand something for a moment, then lose it when they stop revisiting it. This happens because the understanding was never fully integrated. It depended on memory instead of organization. When memory fades, clarity fades with it. Permanent understanding works differently. It reshapes how the brain approaches new information. When the brain is trained to explain, simplify, and rebuild ideas, it begins to expect structure everywhere. New topics are no longer overwhelming. The mind automatically searches for relationships, causes, and constraints. Instead of asking what to remember, it asks what explains the system. This shift dramatically reduces cognitive load. Another sign that understanding has become permanent is transfer. Skills and ideas stop living in isolation. Principles learned in one area quietly appear in another. Patterns repeat across subjects. The brain recognizes them without effort. Learning speeds up not because each topic is easier, but because the mind has become better organized. This permanence also changes emotional responses. Confusion no longer feels threatening. It feels informative. Instead of triggering frustration or avoidance, confusion signals that a model is incomplete. The learner remains calm and curious. Emotional energy is no longer wasted defending false clarity. Identity shifts at this stage as well. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who is good or bad at learning, you begin to see yourself as someone who builds understanding. This identity is stable. It does not depend on quick success. It trusts the process. With that trust, persistence becomes natural rather than forced. Reflection becomes automatic. After learning sessions, the mind revisits ideas quietly, reorganizing them without effort. Sleep and rest strengthen understanding instead of erasing it. This is why learning begins to feel lighter over time. The brain is no longer fighting itself. Importantly, this ability compounds. Each new instance of forced understanding makes the next one easier. The method trains the brain's habits, not just its knowledge. Over time, shallow learning feels uncomfortable, while deep understanding feels satisfying. The brain's preferences change. At this point, effort decreases while results improve. Learning becomes predictable. You know what to do when something feels unclear. You know how to respond when an explanation breaks down. The uncertainty that once caused anxiety now guides progress. This is the quiet advantage of true understanding. It does not announce itself. It does not rely on tricks. It shows up in adaptability, clarity, and calm confidence. Once the brain learns this way, it rarely goes back. Understanding becomes not just something you reach, but something you carry forward into every future skill. And when understanding becomes permanent, what you've seen here is that learning doesn't fail because you're incapable. It fails because familiarity was mistaken for understanding. Real understanding comes from building structure, not collecting explanations. Once you see why the brain avoids that work, the struggle stops feeling personal. And when you use a method that forces clarity, learning changes permanently. If this way of thinking helped you see learning differently, subscribe for the next video, where we'll go deeper into training this habit so every new skill becomes easier to understand, not harder.